This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
African leaders call for an end to vaccine inequality. The WHO says COVID-19 vaccine shipments to Africa need to be increased 7 times over to cope with COVID-19. And Nigerian police arrest 3 suspects believed to have been involved in school abductions. Hello and welcome. You're watching Africa Live. We're coming to live from Nairobi. I'm Hannah Viviersa. Here are more stories making headlines this hour. In business, Zambia's President Hichilema to meet IMF, World Bank officials in Washington. And in sports, South Africa Springboks ready to lock horns with bitter rivals New Zealand All Blacks in Rugby Championship Showdown. When African leaders took to the podium to speak at the United Nations General Assembly on Thursday, many of them spoke out against vaccine inequality. This comes at a time when reports from across the globe indicate that the world is struggling to contain the coronavirus. African countries have little to no access to vaccines. Nokutula Shabalala has more.
Less than 4% of Africa's population has been fully vaccinated. That's a shocking single-number digit when compared to 54% who have been fully vaccinated in the US and 65% in the UK. As the world continues to battle COVID-19, African leaders say vaccines should be sent to low and middle-income countries in order to beat the pandemic.
It is an indictment on humanity that more than 82% of the world's vaccine doses have been acquired by wealthy countries, while less than 1% has gone to low-income countries. Unless we address this as a matter of urgency, the pandemic will last much longer and new mutations of the virus will emerge and spread.
There are concerns that high-income countries have ordered over twice as many vaccine doses as are needed for their populations.
The hoarding and inequitable distribution with the resultant uneven vaccination patterns across the globe is not acceptable. Vaccine nationalism is self-defeating and contrary to the mantra that no one is safe until everyone is safe.
African leaders say it's appalling that rich countries are currently debating booster shot doses while poorer nations are left behind.
The level of vaccine inequity that we see is appalling. It is truly disheartening to see that whilst most of our countries have inoculated less than 2% of our populace and thus seek more vaccines for our people, other countries are about to roll out the 3rd dose, calling it booster vaccine. We tend to forget that nobody is safe until everyone is safe.
Almost 21 million vaccines had arrived in Africa in the month of August through the COVAX initiative. Supplies have been boosted by wealthier countries donating to COVAX. African countries are expected to receive about 95 million doses through this scheme in September. Noktula Shabalala, CGTN.
On the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Germany and France convened a meeting on climate change and COVID-19 recovery. The inequality of COVID-19 vaccine distribution came into sharper focus at the gathering. Speakers, including those from the World Health Organization, have urged UN member states to support a proposal to temporarily waive certain intellectual property rights established by the World Trade Organization. The measure is to allow more countries, particularly low and middle income countries, to produce COVID-19 vaccines.
The pandemic is a powerful demonstration that we can only face multilateral problems with multilateral solutions. That includes the global vaccines crisis. We welcome yesterday's summit hosted by the President of the United States of America and for the strong support expressed by many countries for achieving WHO's vaccination targets to vaccinate 40% of the population of every country by the end of this year and 70% by the middle of next year. To reach those targets, we need 2 billion doses for low and lower middle income countries right now. We call on the countries and companies that control the global supply of vaccines to swap their near-term vaccine deliveries with COVAX and AVAT, to fulfill their dose sharing pledges immediately, and to facilitate the immediate sharing of technology, know-how, and intellectual property.
The World Health Organization's Africa Regional Office says COVID-19 vaccine shipments to Africa must be increased from the current 20 million per month to 150 million on average if the continent is to fully vaccinate 70% of its population by September of 2022. The 70% target was arrived at during the global COVID-19 summit hosted by the U.S. on the margins of the UN General Assembly. CGTN's Daniel Arab Moy reports.
A shortage of vaccines and uncertainty surrounding their deliveries have been a major challenge for many African countries. Vaccine nationalism and delays in rolling out the available vaccines have led to threats of new variants emerging.
What is needed now are strong accountability mechanisms to ensure these targets translate into real and concrete results in countries, and that promises made are promises kept on sharing vaccines. You will agree with me that actions speak far louder than words.
The World Health Organization says a global coordination mechanism is needed to bring together vaccine-producing nations to promote transparency in vaccines delivery. Currently, 1 in 3 people globally have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. In Africa, that number drops to 1 in 25 people. With the festive season fast approaching, there are fears that COVID-19 cases could rise.
Fresh increases in cases should be expected in the coming months.
This is the continuing socio-economic pandemic, and the way to end it is to vaccinate as many Africans as rapidly as possible.
Africa has so far recorded over 8 million positive cases. WHO has urged healthcare workers to regroup and prepare for the next wave that is expected before the end of the year. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, CGTN's Daniel Arab Moy now joins us here in Nairobi, along with Deji Badmosi in Lagos, Yasser Kim in Cairo, and Angela Coppola in Johannesburg. Daniel, let's begin the conversation with you. African governments have ramped up their vaccination campaigns, but the rate of inoculations continue to be very low. Why is that the case, Daniel?
Well, thank you very much, Anna. Yes, that is a good question indeed. In Africa, the uptake of vaccine remains low, and WHO did mention that yesterday during their presser in Brazzaville. Now, the biggest challenge that African countries have seen is the inconsistency in vaccine supply. Some of the countries in Africa received their first shipment of vaccine, and it took them 2, 3, 4, some up to 6 months to receive their second shipment, and that has been a challenge. So such countries have seen a challenge in the uptake of COVID-19 vaccination because it takes too long to receive the second batch of vaccine shipment. But also most important to note here is that there is still the question of vaccine hesitancy. Some people still think that vaccines will not help cure them. Some think vaccines will kill them. And this has affected many countries in Africa. So there is a need to sensitize people that vaccines can help save lives. Now, here in Kenya, the government says at least 1 out of 10 people who receive their first jab are yet to receive their second jab. And that is still because vaccines took time to arrive in Kenya. But now we are seeing they started coming. So it will take long for people to receive their second jab unless shipments continue to come into African countries. Now, here in Kenya, my colleague Enoch Sikolia filed this report. Let's take a look.
Kenya has enhanced the inoculation of the people with COVID-19 vaccine, and we are here in the capital to do a random check on the number of people who have been fully vaccinated and those yet to receive the second dose. Have you been vaccinated?
No.
Why haven't you been vaccinated?
Because I was very busy.
Have you been vaccinated?
Yes, I have.
How many doses?
1.
The data highlighting the scale of the problem is clear. Kenya's Ministry of Health says over 100,000 people skipped their second doses. The chairman of Kenya's COVID vaccine deployment task force, Dr. Willis Ahwale, says those who did so wanted to get vaccines they believe have higher efficacy.
Some people are choosy on what they wanted. So there are those who had got AstraZeneca and now they heard Kenya is going to get the other vaccines and they were thinking they needed to shift to another vaccine.
Kenya has received 5 different COVID-19 vaccines. They are AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, Sinopharm, and Johnson & Johnson. Only the Johnson & Johnson jab requires a single dose to have one fully inoculated.
If you don't get a second dose, you are not fully protected. You are partially protected. And therefore, you will not get the full benefits of the vaccine.
Maria Diana is a social worker at a community hospital in Nairobi. She says some people were discouraged by the unavailability of the second jab when they went to get inoculated. That is a problem the government acknowledges.
When I went for the second vaccine, the vaccine was not there. Yeah. So they told us to come back later.
Given the shortages that we had, not all facilities were able to have that consistent supply for the second dose. And this is a lesson we've learned, so that during this phase now, we are reserving a second dose of the vaccines. We are not sending everything out.
Kenya has administered at least 3.4 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines so far, and about 829,000 people have received their second doses. This means 1 in 10 people who got their first dose haven't gotten their second.
I've not been fully vaccinated. I was vaccinated last month, and the second dose I'll get it on November.
Kenya's Ministry of Health is now tracking those who skipped the second dose through the information they provided when they received the first dose. But there are those who have completely refused to get vaccinated. John Odimba, a street entertainer, is one of them.
I've heard people saying that those people who are vaccinated and it has given them side effects. So there are so many stories. So when you hear stories such as that, you don't go. You wait to see if it is true.
The Kenyan government says it has embarked on countering misinformation as it tries to scale up vaccinations to curb the spread of COVID-19. Enoch Sikoli, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, we'll continue that conversation with our colleague Daniel here in Nairobi. Daniel, I know that you're going to be speaking to our colleagues from northwestern and southern Africa, but for now, just speak to us about what's happening here in East Africa when it comes to status of vaccinations across the region.
Yes, Anna, indeed, the World Health Organization says vaccines have begun trickling in many countries across Africa. But to just have a quick look at the statistics in East Africa, in Tanzania, 0.6% of the country's total population have been vaccinated. And in Uganda, the figure stands at 0.9% of the country's total population that have been fully vaccinated. Here in Kenya, we are looking at 1.7% of the country's total population that has been fully vaccinated. In Rwanda, the figure stands at 10.8% of the country's total population that have been fully vaccinated. Now, for more on the status of vaccination across Africa, let's get to Angelo in South Africa. Angelo, Africa needs a 7-fold rise in COVID-19 vaccine shipment to fully vaccinate at least 70% of its population by September 2022. What is the status like in South Africa and the region indeed?
Well, look, Daniel, the vaccination count in South Africa is now at around 12 million people that have been vaccinated who are over the age of 18 with either the one-shot J&J vaccine or the two-shot Pfizer vaccine. So that's a little over 20% of the population. The vaccination rate has in fact eased over the last week, and this is a concern for authorities here. In fact, it's down 14% week on week based on data that we're seeing. Some businesses also have started now insisting that their staff need to get vaccinated before they come back to the office. Notably, Discovery Health was the first to mandate vaccinations for staff, but the jury is still out on whether this is in fact legal or not. Regionally, Botswana has 4 approved vaccines and 25% of the population there is vaccinated, so that's quite a good number. Mozambique is reporting a vaccination rate of around 5.7%. Madagascar is at a very low 0.7%. Namibia comes in at 6.4%. Angola at around 3.1% currently. Zimbabwe, on the other hand, is doing a lot better at 14.7%. While Eswatini, which is on the border of South Africa, is at 7.4%, and Lesotho at about 11.2%. So the percentages show that all the countries in the Southern Bloc are well behind target and unlikely to reach population immunity by the end of the year. In South Africa, it's a combination of vaccine hesitancy, and initially there was a problem with the supplies, but that has now been dealt with. So September 2022 as a deadline for a 70% vaccine rate target seems a little bit far off for countries in the Southern Bloc at the moment. Daniel?
Thank you there. Now, let's get to Nigeria. Deji, misconception and conspiracy theories are stalling vaccination progress in Nigeria. How is the vaccination exercise going on in Nigeria and the region?
Well, across Nigeria, the situation is not very much different as what we have seen the previous week. The total number of persons that have been vaccinated in this country so far, I'm talking about those who have been vaccinated, including the first and second dose now, is just around let's just say around 6.8 million. And of that number now, just around 1.78 million have been fully vaccinated. And now that brings the total number of people vaccinated in this country, both for the first and second dose now, to just around 0.9%. So Nigeria has not vaccinated up to 1% of its population. Of course, you still have the problem of conspiracy, but it's not much of a problem, I should say. The biggest problem we have at the moment is that there are not enough vaccines to go around. As we speak now, the second phase of the vaccination is going on, and quite a number of vaccination sites have actually run out of supply. The vaccines are not available. The government is expecting more to come in the coming weeks. So the problem, I should say, is more of the unavailability of vaccine rather than vaccine conspiracy or vaccine hesitancy. Now, across the West African region, it's still the same thing. In Ghana, just around 2.5% of the population has been vaccinated, and that 2.5 it's for those who have been fully vaccinated and those who have taken the first dose. In Senegal, which has done, well, some people will say has done relatively well, but the numbers are still very low. It's just 3.5% of the population there has been vaccinated. Across the other countries in the region, in quite a number of places, less than 1% of the population have been vaccinated. Mention them, whether it's Liberia, Sierra Leone, and what have you. So it's a very poor picture when it comes to vaccination, no doubt. And the problem is that the vaccines are not available. They are not coming in as fast as people would expect. So that's pretty much the situation in Nigeria and across the West African sub-region. But then let's go to North Africa now to find out what the situation is. Yes, sir. We saw COVID-19 cases coming down over the past few weeks in the North African region after, of course, a spike we saw in the summer. So what is the latest on the COVID situation there and the status of vaccination across the region?
All right, thank you. And concerning the North African region, we will sort of divide Tunis and Morocco first, because they are quite similar in that they have managed to find a huge drop in number of cases lately, and that's because of the strict measures they have taken in the last couple of months. and of course the increase in the rate of inoculation in these two countries. Tunisia, for example, has reached around 25 or 26% of its population have been inoculated, while Morocco has exceeded 49%, which is the highest in the region. And that's why we've seen a drop in the cases in those two countries, although they have been suffering from a high death to cases per case in both countries. So the death rate is high in those cases from COVID-19. If you look at Egypt and Algeria, Algeria first, the number of cases has dropped, but still the number of inoculated people is still low at about 13%. And this very low rate concerning the region needs to be quickened, but the problem is obviously the supply of vaccines, not to do with the population itself, but the slow supply of vaccines. If you look at Egypt, Egypt has seen a big drop before, until the beginning of September, actually, and from mid-September, cases have started to go up again. First of all, because Egyptians have relaxed their measures, knowing that the numbers have dropped very much in the last month. So they started to relax their measures, and this caused an increase in the number of cases. We've seen it double in the last week, which is quite alarming for the government, although they're still low at about 672 cases per day in the last 3 days. So what about the cases of inoculation? Egypt has seen a slow increase in inoculation process since the beginning of the year, but now it is picking up for two reasons. First of all, that Egypt has started producing the Sinovac vaccine in Egypt, and it has promised that next year it will produce 1 billion doses from the vaccines from two plants, probably the Sinovac and a Russian vaccine will be produced in Egypt at high numbers. Egypt only needs 200 million doses, so the rest will be exported to the rest of Africa. So it will pick up in the near future, but at the moment it's slowly increasing, and hoping that this will bring the numbers down again by the end of the year. Back to you.
And let's get down to North Africa with Yasser. Now, Yasser, North Africa COVID-19 cases are plummeting after summer spike. What is the latest on the number of cases and the status of vaccination?
Well, thank you so much to all our colleagues from here in the East Africa region, in North Africa, in West Africa, and in Southern Africa, just giving us a picture of what's happening when it comes to vaccination uptake in those regions. We're now joined by Dr. Olalekan Oshunkuya, a policy analyst based in Abuja, Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Why are we still seeing vaccine hesitancy across the continent?
Thank you for having me. I think a good reason for hesitancy is one thing is about the history of vaccination in Africa, because there has been a lot of misinformation about what the roles of vaccine and what vaccines can be used at and how helpful it can be. And this vaccination with the previous pandemic or previous diseases. And this has led to a compounded essence as well. So, but I think the biggest part is because of misinformation about the origin of the disease, and then the effect of the vaccine long term is the reason why people are accident, and this has been during the pandemic when it was it's been really largely misinformed about what the percent, and a lot of people are not as informed as they should be, and this wrong information has been that around everywhere is making, especially in villages and communities where they have very limited access to information. They rely on the word of mouth of the religious leaders, of community leaders, of to just basically make opinions of things like this. They were unable to actually get the right information, and this is resulting now in some hesitancy around whether or not they should be vaccinated to get protected on COVID-19.
Dr. Oshunkuya, a policy analyst based in Abuja, Nigeria, thank you so much for joining us on the program. We'll move on to Zimbabwe now, and the southern African country has bolstered its vaccination campaign with a partnership with China. China has offered vaccine support to enable Zimbabwe to inoculate at least 60% of its population against COVID-19. Zimbabwean President Emerson Mnangagwa has hailed China's friendship.
Currently, we have been faced by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected every single country on our planet, and Zimbabwe is not spared. And I'm glad to say friendly countries like China have come to our assistance. They've allowed us to access the vaccines from their headquarters.
We want to target as many people as possible. Yeah, because we hope by end of year we should have vaccinated about 10 million people by then. So it means the more we get more healthcare workers delivering the vaccines, the better we stand.
Well, an appeal to cooperation and a call to action at the UN General Assembly, finding solutions to climate change is one of the major topics at this year's session. Most agree the crisis is spiraling out of control, making the world less safe. CGTN's John Terrett reports.
The UN Security Council meeting in early session in New York on Thursday under the banner headline of climate change and conflict. Secretary General Antonio Guterres calling for bold action on climate change or risk security, he said, all over the world. The SG has often drawn a straight line link between climate change and conflict, particularly on the continent of Africa, because of things like extreme flooding and extreme drought leading to damaged crops, and then that in turn leading to fighting or conflict. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, addressed the Council, saying the time has come to stop asking if the UN Security Council is the appropriate body to discuss things like climate change and conflict.
We're taking into account how every bilateral and multilateral engagement we have, every policy decision we make, will impact our goal of putting the world on a safer, more sustainable path.
避免不加区分地将气候因素
We therefore must refrain from using a wholesale approach for the climate issue as the key to address all problems. We must refrain from including in the mandate peacekeeping operations so as to not affect the Security Council effectively delivering its mandate, so as to refrain from any job duplications.
And talking of food security, the UN Food Systems Summit also takes place in New York on Thursday. It has very lofty ambitions: school meals for all children, zero food waste in the world, and an agricultural innovation mission for climate. In other words, how to deal with extreme drought and extreme flooding and still grow crops in the world and distribute them equitably. It is supposed to be a trigger for a transformation of food systems globally. And Chu Dong-ye, who is the Director General of the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, the first Chinese person to hold that position, will be attending the event on Thursday. He's been in that post since August 2019. John Terrett, CGTN, at the United Nations in New York.
Meanwhile, the Director General of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, John Nkegasong, has criticized Britain for not recognizing vaccines administered in Africa. Nkegasong called the situation regrettable and asked the British government to review its requirements, saying they send a confusing public health message. The UK last week announced it would expand the list of countries whose vaccines it recognizes. The latest list has 17 countries and has no African country on it. In the meantime, the British High Commission in Kenya and the Kenyan Health Ministry have said it would take time to set up a system to acknowledge certificates for international travel. Well, for more on this issue, we're joined by Giram Chala, who is in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, for us, and Paul Barber, who is in London. Giram, let's begin with you. Thank you first to both of you for joining us on the program. Giram, let's begin with you in Addis. What more can you tell us about Africa's CDC's criticism of these UK vaccine rules?
Hannah, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention officials remain outraged by this discriminatory decision by the British government, and they said that there is no scientific reasoning behind this decision whatsoever for a British government to say that we will not accept vaccinations administered in the continent. As we know, the African continent is the least affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also arguably is the least vaccinated. But that doesn't mean that African states are administering vaccinations which are produced by global manufacturers, including those affiliated with England, if you like, wrongfully. So according to the CDC officials, they say that they need the reconsideration of the British government to accept what is scientifically can be proven without making political decisions, and they should open their eyes and help African states in the state to gain more vaccination doses that prevent those success stories from entering the country, or also recognize them generally. So the Africa CDC is still demanding the British government to revisit its decisions, but for now, as I said earlier, they remain outraged by the decision.
Paul, let's bring it to you in London. What are these UK vaccine rules? Can you give us some clarity on that? And which vaccines in particular are being targeted here?
Yes, Hannah, these were rules that were announced last week, and they come into force from October the 4th. And they concern the AstraZeneca vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. Only people who've had full vaccination from one of these producers will be allowed into the UK without having to go into a quarantine in a hotel for 10 days. None of those countries, as Giram was saying, are from Africa. They've added some new countries that the vaccine programs and certificates would be accepted from. These include most countries from the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some countries from the Middle East. But this essentially means millions of people from across the African continent and Asia and Latin America would not be allowed into the UK, even if they've had 2 vaccinations. The WHO has said that this isn't really about the quality of the vaccines themselves, it's about trust in the healthcare systems to generate vaccine certificates and proof of vaccines. But it's leading to this bizarre situation, which, as Giram was saying, has been branded as discriminatory, even some countries saying this is racist, saying, you know, that essentially UK distributed AstraZeneca vaccines, mostly AstraZeneca vaccines we're talking about in Africa, those vaccines would not be recognised should those citizens want to enter into the UK. Another change that's happened in the UK in the last couple of days is that the red list of countries where people would have to quarantine for 10 days in special hotels has been reviewed. 2 African countries have been taken off it and put on what's for the time being is still called the amber list, that is Kenya and Egypt, but essentially it doesn't make much difference because anyone coming from those countries with 2 vaccines, it still would not be recognised here. And the UK is a real outlier here. The European Union, even the United States, have much more open systems currently. The UK High Commissioner to Nairobi, as you said, Jane Marriott-Howe, and the Kenyan Health Cabinet Secretary Mutahi Kagwe have said that they are working together to establish a system of mutually recognising each country's vaccine certificates. The UK has also made a separate statement saying that they've always said they'd take a phased approach to the rollout of our inbound vaccination program to other countries and territories, building on the success of our pilot with the US and Europe. We will review the policy and consider any additions every 3 weeks. Hannah.
Paul Barber speaking to us from London, Giram Chala speaking to us from Addis Ababa. Thank you so much to you both. Well, let's now take a short break and return. More news making headlines here on Africa Live, including Nigerian police arrest 3 suspects linked with recent school abductions. And leaders in Khartoum trade blame over coup attempt.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. You're watching News Making Headlines right here on Africa Live. We go to Nigeria now, where police say they've arrested 3 suspects behind the abduction of more than 100 students in Kaduna State. The suspects are among 50 others believed to be members of different gangs operating in northwest and central Nigeria. Police say they are on the trail of 22 other members of the gang who are part of the abductions. State governments in the region are recruiting vigilantes to help secure the area. CGTN's Tesem Akende is in Jos and joins us now for more on that story. Tesem, good to see you. What more can you tell us about the arrests?
Well, the arrest has happened, and the implication is that efforts at having a more secure Kaduna State and, of course, a more secure Nigeria are actually paving results. These members, these 3 suspects that have been arrested, are said just to be a part of several other gangs. So what has happened, it shows that there's some respite coming. The attack or the invasion on the school which they came to, talking about the Bethel Baptist School, left them going with hundreds of students, over 100 students, I beg your pardon. That had really affected education in that state. The state had to shut down several schools because for the security of the students. So the arrest of these suspects, gives a sigh of relief somehow to the authorities that before long, more enemies of peace will be caught and respite to come, especially for the educational system in Kaduna State and, of course, by extension, other states in Nigeria.
Tesem, I would imagine that this is such welcome news in that part of the country. What do the arrests mean for the fight against bandits and militants in Nigeria as a whole?
Well, this means that nobody is above the Nigerian state, enemies of the Nigerian state. It only shows that before long they will be dealt with. The governor of that state, talking about Nasir El-Rufai, has always maintained that there will be no negotiation with bandits. There will be no negotiation at all. He believes they are criminals, and several other governors within the region are trying to buy into this thinking. Before now, there were negotiations, there was amnesty given to bandits and all of that. All of that is changing. Several other governors are coming on the same page with this governor, the governor of Kaduna State, where this happened. So this means that the state remains supreme. Those enemies of peace who have been causing pain, kidnapping people for ransom and all of that, that will change. The state will get onto them. It also means that the operations being carried out by security agencies, joint operations are ongoing now between the Air Force, the Army, the police, and other agencies. It means that these efforts are actually yielding results. So it means that the state will win the battle someday. It's not yet over. But with 3 suspects being, arrested, and it means that there will be more confessions coming out, and perhaps more releases, more arrests will be made of suspects who have been kidnapping people, not just in Kaduna State, talking about other states in northwest Nigeria and, of course, north central. It means that there's some hope coming for peace in Nigeria.
Hope indeed. Thank you so much for all that. Tesem Akende speaking to us from Jos, Nigeria. Well, moving on to Sudan now, where finger-pointing continues between leaders in Khartoum over a claimed foiled coup attempt earlier this week. Military chefs have accused civilian politicians in the country of creating conditions that led to the incident and pursuing personal gains instead of public interest. Naba Muhyiddin has more from Khartoum.
A blame game is underway over Tuesday's reported coup attempt in Sudan. Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok has accused figures from the country's former government of being behind it. But military generals say civilian leaders are responsible for the turn of events.
It's so obvious that some establishments have no goals but pursuing shares in the ministries and states, and they are battling for it. We haven't seen any of the parties or the political powers care about the elections or even the end of the transitional period.
The government says a number of suspects have been arrested and are being questioned. The Prime Minister says military and non-military figures linked to the former administration of Omar al-Bashir are suspected of involvement in the attempted coup. But the Deputy Chief of the Sovereign Council, General Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, claims the government created the conditions for the incident.
We frankly said the politicians paved the way for the repeated coups because they neglected the citizens and their living and the basic services. They were busy with sharing the power and seats.
Mass demonstrations flared up in Sudan in 2019 over fuel and bread shortages. Military generals removed the then leader Omar al-Bashir from power and put him in detention. Protest leaders then shared power with the generals. Analysts think this partnership between the civilians and the generals is strained.
It seems the partnership between the military generals and the civilians won't continue for a long time. Only elections shall put the militants back to their barracks and balance the power for the politicians. This is the only democratic solution to take the country out of the military-civilian repeated conflict.
While military and civilian leaders tread criticisms, Sudan's economy is struggling. Recovering economic growth may be difficult, while a fragile security situation adds uncertainty to transitional challenges. Under the power-sharing agreement, military leaders were to rule Sudan for 21 months, before civilians took over 18 months ahead of the elections in 2022. But the generals' agreed period at the helm has ended without them transferring power to civilian leaders. Naba Muhyiddin, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
Well, it's time now for a second short break and return. More news making headlines in the world of business. We'll see you in a bit.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Time now for the business news. Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema is expected to meet officials at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank in the coming days. It's the latest attempt at Africa's second biggest copper producer's undertaking to secure a lending program to help it emerge from a debt crisis. CGTN's Najma Abdurazak takes a look at what to expect ahead of the meeting.
Over $3 billion in Eurobond debt and a further $3 billion owed to China. These are just some of the challenges at stake as both Zambia and the International Monetary Fund get ready for their latest talks in the days ahead. President Hakainde Hichilema is in the U.S. this week for the United Nations General Assembly. According to his spokesman, Hichilema is expected to meet officials at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in Washington. Zambia's government formally asked the IMF for financing arrangement last December. The Southern African copper producer is betting on an IMF deal to restore creditor confidence. And an IMF loan arrangement will also steer President Hichilema's much-needed economic reform plan into action. Hichilema was elected last month on a promise to tackle corruption and to end Zambia's deepening financial and economic crisis. According to the African Development Bank, Zambia's economy plunged into its first recession since 1998 last year, contracting nearly 5%. In November 2020, Zambia also became the first African nation to default on its sovereign debt since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, when it stopped servicing payments on nearly $13 billion of international debt. The government has a $750 million Eurobond due next year. The global shutdown came on the tails of a challenging few years, which had seen growth slow to around 3% since 2015. Economists, however, now expect the international confidence in Hichilema's presidency and the strengthening of the local kwacha currency since his election to help Zambia secure a deal in its latest talks with the IMF. Najma Abdirazak, CGTN.
Well, South African Airways, the country's national carrier, resumed operations on Thursday, almost a year after it was grounded due to the pandemic, and the business rescue process put in place soon after that. Angela Coppola has more on that story.
The airline restarted with a limited local offering, with 3 flights per week between Johannesburg and Cape Town.
A big chunk of whether they will be successful or not will depend upon whether the new management actually has a mandate to be able to operate independently and commercially. At this point of time, they've made the right noises about bringing in a private sector partner, but that has not yet come into play.
The timing of the re-entry of the airline into the regional market is critical.
The biggest thing that is working in their favor is going to be the restructuring of the route network and hopefully trimming off the costs. The new route network that they're starting with is only going to be with 4 aircraft, and it's going to be to a bunch of destinations that have traditionally been very lucrative for South African Airways. That's Lusaka, Maputo, Harare, Kinshasa, and Accra.
The battle now begins for the hearts and minds of the traveling consumer, after more than $1 billion in taxpayers' bailouts.
So changing that perception and making the public aware that this is something new. There have been very, very problematic labor relations at South African Airways towards the end. And, once again, these are all things which have negatively affected the brand, and that the new airline, which is still using the same brand, is going to have to overcome before they're able to win flyers back.
It appears that there are some travellers prepared to give SAA another chance.
Because it's a proudly South African company, I rather support our own. In the past, I used to fly SAA all the time, whether, nationally and internationally. So I am concerned, but I just want to see, what's going to happen.
So I think going with them, giving them our support, and we're very patriotic people. So I think they're going to take off, and it's going to be a good future. Everybody has a wobble. I think they'll recover nicely.
SAA took to the skies with a limited offering, first domestically and then regionally. It's all going to depend now on whether there's any interest from consumers. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN at OR Tambo International Airport in South Africa.
Sport news coming up after the break, including South Africa's Springboks ready to lock horns with bitter rivals New Zealand's All Blacks in Rugby Championship showdown.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born